Brigham Young was a Vermont farm boy and a devoted religious leader who became the Moses of the Mormon people. Brigham Young, the second president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, was born in Whitingham, Vermont on June 1, 1801. He came from a humble family. He had a commanding presence. Young's early years were marked by poverty and hardship. He received only 11 days of formal schooling in his entire life. When he was 14 years old, his mother died, leaving young Brigham to help raise his younger siblings while working on the family farm. The Young family moved frequently, seeking better opportunities in the frontier territories of New York State. Brigham learned carpentry, painting, and glazing, becoming a skilled craftsman and tradesman. In 1824, at the age of 23, Brigham Young married Miriam Works. They settled in western New York where he worked as a carpenter and joiner, building homes and furniture. Young was searching for religious truth during a time of great spiritual awakening in America. The region where he lived was called the Burned-Over District because of the intense religious revivals that swept through it like wildfire. Brigham Young was skeptical of the emotional excesses he witnessed at revival meetings. He wanted something more substantial, something that spoke to both his mind and his heart. In 1830, Brigham Young first encountered the Book of Mormon. A copy of the book was brought to his home by his brother Phineas, who had already joined the new religious movement. Brigham studied the book carefully for 2 years before making his decision. He was methodical and deliberate in all things. He examined the claims of Joseph Smith, the young prophet who said he had translated the book from golden plates revealed to him by an angel. Young was not one to be swept away by enthusiasm or emotion. He investigated thoroughly, and in April 1832, at the age of 30, Brigham Young was baptized into the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Young's conversion came at a terrible personal cost. Just weeks after his baptism, his wife Miriam died from tuberculosis, leaving him alone with 2 young daughters. Despite his grief, Brigham Young threw himself into missionary work for his new faith. He traveled throughout the northeastern states, preaching the Mormon message and gaining converts. He was a natural leader and organizer. His practical skills and steady temperament made him invaluable to the growing church. In 1835, Young was called to be one of the 12 apostles, the governing body of the church under Joseph Smith. Brigham Young met Joseph Smith in Kirtland, Ohio, and the 2 men formed a deep bond of friendship and religious devotion. Young became one of Smith's most trusted lieutenants. He led missionary expeditions to England, bringing thousands of converts back to America. He oversaw the construction of temples and the establishment of new Mormon settlements. Young was utterly devoted to Joseph Smith, whom he regarded as a prophet of God. He defended Smith against critics and enemies. He followed Smith's teachings without question, including the controversial practice of plural marriage. The Mormons faced intense persecution wherever they settled. In Missouri, mobs attacked Mormon settlements, burning homes and driving families into the wilderness. The governor of Missouri issued an extermination order, declaring that the Mormons must be driven from the state or eliminated. The Mormons fled to Illinois, where they built the city of Nauvoo on a swamp along the Mississippi River. Under Joseph Smith's leadership, Nauvoo grew rapidly, becoming one of the largest cities in Illinois. Brigham Young supervised much of the construction, organizing work crews and managing resources. But the persecution followed them to Illinois. Joseph Smith's claims to prophetic authority, his practice of plural marriage, and his political ambitions made him enemies. In June 1844, a mob stormed the jail in Carthage, Illinois, where Joseph Smith was being held on charges of treason. The mob murdered Joseph Smith and his brother Hiram. The Mormon people were left without their prophet. They were sheep without a shepherd, vulnerable and afraid. Several men claimed the right to succeed Joseph Smith as leader of the church. There was confusion and division among the Mormon people. Brigham Young was in Boston on a missionary journey when he received news of Joseph Smith's death. He rushed back to Nauvoo. When he arrived, he found the church in crisis. Some wanted to follow Joseph Smith's son. Others supported Sidney Rigdon, who had been Smith's counselor. But when Brigham Young stood before the assembled Mormons and began to speak, witnesses later said that something remarkable happened. They said his voice changed and became like Joseph Smith's voice. They said his face was transfigured and looked like Joseph Smith's face. Whether this was literal truth or the product of grief and hope and desperate need, the effect was undeniable. The Mormon people accepted Brigham Young as their new leader. Young moved quickly to consolidate his authority. He was elected president of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, and through that body he governed the church. He was not Joseph Smith. He did not claim to receive the constant stream of revelations that Smith had received. Young was a practical man, an organizer, an administrator. He was concerned with the survival of the Mormon people in a hostile world. He understood that they could not remain in Nauvoo. The persecution would continue. The state of Illinois was turning against them. Mobs were attacking outlying Mormon settlements. Young made the momentous decision that would define his legacy. The Mormons would leave the United States entirely. They would go west, into the wilderness, beyond the reach of their enemies. In February 1846, in the dead of winter, the first wagons of Mormon refugees crossed the frozen Mississippi River, leaving Nauvoo behind. It was an exodus of biblical proportions. 15,000 men, women, and children abandoned their homes and their city and set out into the unknown wilderness. They called Brigham Young their Moses, leading them to a promised land. Young organized the exodus with military precision. He divided the refugees into companies, each with a captain. He established way stations along the trail where later companies could find supplies and rest. He sent advance parties ahead to scout the route and plant crops. The journey was brutal beyond imagining. The Mormon pioneers crossed the Great Plains in covered wagons pulled by oxen. They endured blizzards and floods, disease and starvation. Children were born on the trail. Old people died and were buried in unmarked graves. The wagons broke down. The oxen died. Families ran out of food and ate whatever they could find. Some walked the entire distance barefoot because their shoes had worn out. Brigham Young drove them forward relentlessly. He would not allow them to give up. He would not allow them to turn back. He promised them that God would lead them to a place of safety and refuge. In July 1847, Brigham Young led an advance party of pioneers into the Salt Lake Valley. Young was sick with mountain fever when they arrived, lying in the back of a wagon. But when he saw the valley spread out before him, surrounded by mountains, he knew this was the place. The valley was a desert, barren and dry. Nothing grew there except sagebrush. There were no trees. The soil was alkaline. Most people would have looked at the desolate landscape and seen only death. Brigham Young saw possibility. He saw water in the mountains. He saw land that could be irrigated. He saw a place so remote and uninviting that no one else would want it, and therefore a place where the Mormons could finally be left in peace. Young immediately began organizing the settlement. He laid out the streets of Salt Lake City in a grid pattern, wide enough for a wagon to turn around. He assigned plots of land to families. He organized work parties to dig irrigation ditches, bringing water from the mountain streams to the desert floor. He sent expeditions to explore the surrounding territory. Within months, the Mormons had planted crops and built homes. More wagon trains arrived throughout the summer and fall, bringing thousands more refugees from Nauvoo. The first winter was desperate. The crops failed. The settlers had arrived too late in the season to plant successfully. Food was scarce. They ate roots and hides. They killed their cattle and rationed the meat. Some wanted to leave, to go to California where gold had been discovered. Brigham Young forbade it. He told them that if they left for the gold fields, they would lose their souls. He kept the community together through the force of his will and his unshakable faith that God had led them to this place. In the spring, they planted again, and this time the crops grew. The irrigation system worked. The desert began to bloom. Brigham Young sent missionaries back east and to Europe, calling the Mormon people to gather in Zion. Thousands responded, making the long journey across the plains. Young organized the Perpetual Emigrating Fund, which loaned money to poor converts so they could afford the journey. He expected them to repay the loan once they were established in Utah so that others could be helped in turn. It was typical of Young's practical approach to building the kingdom of God on earth. In 1850, the territory of Utah was organized, and Brigham Young was appointed territorial governor by President Millard Fillmore. Young now held both religious and political authority over the Mormon settlements. He governed with an iron hand. He believed in order and obedience. He believed that the Mormon people had been chosen by God for a special purpose, and that purpose required discipline and sacrifice. Young established a theocracy in Utah, a government ruled by religious law. Church and state were one. Young's word was law, both spiritual and temporal. Brigham Young was a colonizer on a grand scale. He sent Mormon families to establish settlements throughout the Great Basin and beyond. He founded over 300 towns and cities. He sent colonists to San Bernardino, California, and to Las Vegas, Nevada. He sent them to southern Utah to grow cotton. He sent them to northern Utah to farm wheat. He sent them to the mountains to mine iron and coal. Young believed in self-sufficiency. He wanted the Mormon people to be independent of the outside world, to produce everything they needed themselves. He encouraged the development of industries and crafts. He established a system of cooperative stores. But Brigham Young could not escape the conflicts that had plagued the Mormons in Missouri and Illinois. The practice of plural marriage, which Joseph Smith had introduced and which Young defended and practiced openly, made the Mormons objects of scandal and outrage in the rest of America. Young himself married dozens of women. The exact number is disputed, but it was at least 55. He fathered 57 children. Young defended plural marriage as a commandment from God, revealed to Joseph Smith. He said it was a higher law, a test of faith and obedience. Critics called it barbaric and immoral. They compared the Mormons to the polygamous societies of the Middle East and Africa. The federal government began to take action against the Mormon practice of plural marriage. In 1856, the Republican Party platform called for the elimination of the twin relics of barbarism, slavery and polygamy. After the Civil War, the government turned its attention to Utah. Congress passed laws making plural marriage illegal. Federal judges and marshals were sent to Utah to enforce these laws. Brigham Young was indicted for polygamy, though he was never brought to trial. The conflict between the Mormon Church and the federal government reached its peak in 1857 when President James Buchanan, responding to reports of Mormon rebellion and lawlessness, sent the United States Army to Utah to replace Brigham Young as territorial governor and to enforce federal authority. Young saw this as an invasion. He declared martial law and prepared to resist. He called the Mormon settlers in outlying areas to abandon their homes and retreat to Salt Lake City. He sent militia units to harass the approaching army, burning supply wagons and driving off cattle. He threatened to burn Salt Lake City to the ground rather than surrender it to federal troops. The Utah War, as it came to be called, never resulted in actual battle. Negotiations were conducted, and a peaceful resolution was reached. The army entered Salt Lake City and established a post, but Brigham Young remained the de facto leader of the Mormon people. The episode demonstrated Young's determination to defend Mormon autonomy and his willingness to use force if necessary. It also demonstrated his pragmatism. When he saw that armed resistance would be futile, he negotiated. The darkest episode of Brigham Young's leadership occurred during this period of tension with the federal government. In September 1857, a wagon train of immigrants from Arkansas and Missouri was passing through southern Utah on its way to California. At a place called Mountain Meadows, the wagon train was attacked by Mormon militiamen and their Native American allies. After a 5-day siege, the Mormons approached under a flag of truce and promised the emigrants safe passage if they would lay down their weapons. The emigrants agreed. But once they were disarmed and separated, the Mormons and their allies massacred them. 120 men, women, and children were killed. Only small children too young to tell what had happened were spared. The Mountain Meadows massacre remains one of the most controversial events in Mormon history. The question of Brigham Young's involvement has never been definitively answered. Young denied ordering the massacre. He claimed that local leaders acted without his knowledge or approval. but Young was known for his tight control over Mormon settlements and his extensive network of communication. Some historians believe he must have known and approved. Others believe that local leaders, caught up in the war fever and afraid that the emigrants were spies or enemies, acted on their own initiative. Young certainly tried to cover up the massacre afterward. For years, the Mormons blamed the attack entirely on Native Americans. Only one man, John D. Lee, was eventually executed for the crime, 20 years after the event. Throughout the 1860s and 1870s, Brigham Young continued to lead the Mormon Church and to develop the Utah Territory. The Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869, linking Utah to the rest of the nation. Young had mixed feelings about the railroad. He understood that it would bring prosperity and growth, but he also feared that it would bring outside influences that would corrupt the Mormon people. He was right on both counts. The railroad brought miners and merchants and gamblers and prostitutes. It brought federal officials and journalists. It made it impossible for the Mormons to remain isolated. Young adapted to the changing circumstances. He encouraged Mormon businesses to compete with the Gentile businesses that were establishing themselves in Salt Lake City. He continued to preach self-sufficiency and cooperation. He established the Zion's Cooperative Mercantile Institution, a church-owned department store that was meant to keep Mormon money within the Mormon community. He continued to defend plural marriage even as the federal government increased its pressure on the church to abandon the practice. Brigham Young was a complex and contradictory figure. He was a devoted religious leader who believed he was doing God's work, but he was also an authoritarian who demanded absolute obedience. He was a visionary colonizer who transformed a desert into a thriving society, but he was also complicit in violence and persecution. He was a practical man who understood economics and organization, but he was also a believer in prophecy and revelation. He preached cooperation and community, but he also accumulated great personal wealth. He owned businesses and property. He lived in a grand house called the Beehive House in Salt Lake City. Young's health began to decline in his 70s. He suffered from rheumatism and other ailments. But he continued to preach and to govern the church until the very end. On August 29, 1877, at the age of 76, Brigham Young died in Salt Lake City. His last words were reportedly "Joseph, Joseph, Joseph," calling out to his beloved prophet and friend. Young was buried in a simple grave in Salt Lake City, in accordance with his wishes. Brigham Young's legacy is deeply contested. To faithful Mormons, he was a prophet and a colonizer, a man who saved the Mormon people from destruction and led them to safety. He established the church on a firm foundation and ensured its survival. He was a practical visionary who built a kingdom in the desert. To critics, Young was a theocratic dictator who practiced polygamy, who may have been complicit in massacre, who oppressed dissenters and ruled through fear. The truth, as always, is more complicated. Young was a man of his time, shaped by the religious enthusiasms and the frontier violence of 19th-century America. He was a survivor who would do whatever was necessary to protect his people. He was a believer who thought he was building the kingdom of God on earth. When he died, he left behind a church that would grow to millions of members worldwide, and a state that would eventually join the Union and prosper. Brigham Young was, even in death, the colonizing prophet who led his people through the wilderness to their promised land.